I stared at the empty velvet chairs on my wedding day, realizing my own blood chose a flashy lie over my sincerity. For 30 years, I was their lifeboat, their easy way out. That all ended the night my new husband burned down their sandcastle on live television. They really thought they abandoned me to sip champagne with a billionaire. They had no idea they were raising their glasses to a federal criminal. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Haley Garza. The day I got married, the sky over Bend, Oregon was a relentless bruised gray. A heavy snow had been falling since dawn, burying the secluded pine lodge we had rented under thick, silent blankets of white. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, the kind that pressed against the frosted windows and made the roaring fire in the main hearth seem like the only living thing in the room. The scent of burning cedar and fresh pine needles hung in the air, creating a small sanctuary against the biting cold outside. I stood at the back of the hall, clutching a simple bouquet of pale winter roses, looking out at the seating arrangement. We had meticulously set up 42 velvet-backed chairs in neat curved rows. Out of those 42 chairs, exactly 8 were occupied. The guests sitting there were bundled up in heavy coats, murmuring quietly to one another. They were mostly Leo's friends from the city planning office, a few of his distant cousins, and my lone college roommate who had driven through the storm just to be here. My entire side of the aisle was a desolate expanse of empty red velvet. I wore a simple, unadorned white dress. There was no heavy lace, no trailing train, no hand-sewn pearls. I was a senior risk analyst working for Ethelgard Risk Management, a private firm where I spent 50 to 60 hours a week calculating disaster probabilities, crunching data, and mitigating catastrophic financial losses for corporate clients. I spent my days preventing fires, metaphorically speaking, only to come home and constantly extinguish the literal ones my family kept starting. For nearly a decade, I had been their designated cleaner. I had drained my savings to cover my father's reckless business ventures, worked weekends to pay off my mother's hidden credit card debts, and endlessly smoothed over the dramatic, destructive fallout of my younger sister's life choices. I was completely and utterly exhausted. The stark simplicity of my dress was not just a stylistic choice, it was a physical reflection of my depleted spirit. I had absolutely nothing left to give them, neither financially nor emotionally. Leo stepped up beside me. My husband, a quiet, meticulous municipal land surveyor, did not deal in hypotheticals, empty flatteries, or grand promises. He dealt in hard dirt, clear boundaries, and undeniable concrete facts. He saw the way my eyes lingered on the empty chairs where my parents and my sister were supposed to be sitting. Another man might have offered hollow comforts, telling me they would come around eventually, or making up excuses that traffic in the snowstorm was just too dangerous for them to travel. Leo did none of that. He knew the truth. Instead, he gently took my freezing hands in his, led me away from the cold draft of the entryway, and pulled me toward the massive stone fireplace. He pressed my palms toward the crackling flames, rubbing warmth back into my numb fingers. When I finally looked up at him, he gave me a solid, peaceful smile. It was the most grounded I had felt in 30 years. He was my anchor in a life that had always felt like a relentless tempest. My family was not stuck in the snow. They were exactly 3 hours away in Portland, safely shielded from the harsh winter storm inside the gilded, climate-controlled ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel. They had unanimously decided to skip my wedding to attend the lavish engagement party of my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe had always been the golden child of the house, the beautiful swan who never had to face a single consequence for her actions. Her new fiancé was Julian Vance, a man who loudly introduced himself to anyone who would listen as a self-made eco-real estate billionaire startup founder. Julian wore custom bespoke suits, drove imported European sports cars, and promised my parents the kind of immense generational wealth they genuinely felt they inherently deserved but had never actually worked to achieve. They were likely sipping vintage champagne next to towering ice sculptures right at this very moment. The memory of the phone call from my mother exactly 3 days prior still echoed bitterly in my mind. I had been sitting on the floor of our living room sealing our modest wedding favors when her name flashed on my phone screen. "Haley, you have to understand the family's position," she had said. Her voice brisk, annoyed, and utterly devoid of guilt. "Julian has connections that could completely change our lives forever. He is introducing us to state senators, elite politicians, and major investors tonight. Your wedding out there in the freezing woods does not exactly have any VIP guests, does it? Us missing your little ceremony for a bit will not matter in the grand scheme of things. You are strong, you can handle it. We will send a gift later." She had hung up before I could even take a breath to reply. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not offer a compromise or express an ounce of sorrow. I was merely an afterthought, a low-return investment casually discarded for a shiny new prospect. Standing there in the comforting warmth of the fire, listening to the soft acoustic guitar playing from the front of the room, I took a deep, shaky breath. I looked at the 8 loyal people who braved a blizzard just to see me happy. I looked at Leo, whose thumb was now gently tracing calming circles on the back of my hand. The emptiness of those 34 chairs hurt an incredibly sharp, localized pain right in the center of my chest. But for the very first time in my entire life, the complete absence of my family felt less like a tragedy and more like a profound, quiet relief. The winter storm outside raged on with bitter fury, but inside, as I linked my arm through Leo's and prepared to walk down the aisle toward a man who actually chose me, everything was finally beautifully still. The storm outside had finally settled into a quiet, frozen night. Inside the lodge, the handful of guests had retreated to their rooms, leaving just my husband and me in the dimly lit reception area. We sat side by side at a small oak table, sharing a miniature lemon tier that the baker had managed to salvage from the weather delays. We were eating our wedding cake with 2 cheap plastic forks, the only utensils we could find after the catering staff had hurried home to beat the blizzard. It was imperfect, a little messy, and entirely ours. I took a bite, the tart lemon cutting through the sweetness, and rested my head against his shoulder. Then the fragile piece shattered. My phone, which I had placed face down on the wooden table hours ago, began to vibrate. It was a short, sharp buzz. I ignored it, keeping my eyes fixed on the dying embers in the hearth. A second passed, then another buzz. Then the device erupted into a relentless, violent seizure against the hard wood. The aggressive rattling noise cut through the romantic silence like a siren. It did not stop. The vibration motor hummed frantically, shaking the phone so hard it began to inch toward the edge of the table. The white backlight bled out from underneath, casting a frantic, strobing glow against the grain of the oak. I pulled my head away from his shoulder, a familiar heavy knot of dread forming instantly in the pit of my stomach. My conditioning kicked in. For years, a ringing phone late at night meant someone in my family had crossed a line, overdrawn an account, or crashed a car, and they needed me to fix it immediately. My hand hovered over the device. I flipped it over. The lock screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications. There were 47 missed calls. There were 83 unread text messages. The names blurred together in a frantic digital panic. Aunt Sarah, Cousin Mark, my mother, Chloe. A voicemail notification popped up at the very top. It was from my mother. My thumb instinctively tapped it before my brain could tell me to stop. I raised the speaker to my ear. My mother was a woman who prided herself on absolute poise, a woman who practiced her passive-aggressive smiles in the mirror. But the voice that tore through the tiny speaker was utterly unrecognizable. It was a raw, hysterical screech, broken by jagged, hyperventilating sobs. "Haley, pick up. Why are you not answering? You have to call me back right now. It is a complete disaster. They took him. There are agents everywhere. They have guns. They are ripping apart the ballroom. It is a nightmare, Haley. Do something. Call someone. Her voice cut off in a sharp click. I sat frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind raced trying to decipher her fragmented panic. Agents. A raided ballroom, I lowered the phone, my breath catching in my throat, ready to slide back into my lifelong role of the crisis manager. I turned to Leo, opening my mouth to tell him we had an emergency. But he was not looking at me. He had already set his plastic fork down on his napkin with deliberate precision. His expression was a portrait of total unflinching calm. Without a word, he reached across the space between us, picked up the heavy black remote control for the television mounted high in the corner of the room, and pressed the power button. The screen flared to life, illuminating our corner of the room in a harsh, cold blue light. He tuned it to Channel 6, the local Portland broadcast network. There was no regular programming. The screen was dominated by a glaring red banner flashing the words, "Breaking News" across the bottom. The live footage was shaky shot from the shoulder of a cameraman rushing through the rain-slicked streets outside the luxury hotel. Red and blue police lights spun wildly, reflecting off the wet pavement and the terrified faces of the city's elite. Women in expensive silk gowns and men in tailored tuxedos were corralled behind yellow police tape, shivering in the cold, their faces pale with shock. The camera zoomed in on the grand glass doors of the hotel lobby. A sudden surge of movement broke through the crowd. It was Julian, the man who was supposed to elevate my family into the stratosphere of high society. He did not look like a tycoon anymore. His custom-tailored velvet suit jacket was ripped at the shoulder. His slicked-back hair hung in greasy, disheveled strands across his sweaty forehead. His face was contorted in a mix of pure terror and disbelief. He was not walking on his own. His arms were pulled forcefully behind his back, secured by heavy steel handcuffs. Two men in tactical gear were frog-marching him out of the lobby. The bold yellow letters on the backs of their dark windbreakers were unmistakable. FBI. And right behind them, agents wearing jackets marked EPA. I stared at the screen, the plastic fork slipping from my fingers and clattering onto the table. The news anchor's voice cut through the chaotic background noise of the broadcast, his tone grave and urgent. We are coming to you live from downtown Portland, where a multi-agency federal raid has just apprehended Julian Vance, a prominent figure in the local real estate development scene. Federal authorities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Environmental Protection Agency, have executed high-level arrest warrants tonight. Sources confirm that Vance's highly publicized luxury eco-resort project was an elaborate front. Investigators allege the operation was a massive multi-million-dollar money-laundering syndicate. Furthermore, the EPA has filed severe charges claiming the supposed eco-friendly land was actually being utilized as an illegal dumping ground for thousands of barrels of highly toxic chemical waste, causing irreparable damage to the regional water table. I could not breathe. The sheer scale of the deception was staggering. The anchor shuffled the papers on his desk, looking directly into the camera. The red banner at the bottom of the screen updated with new text. The sudden and decisive nature of tonight's raid is the result of a covert 6-month joint task force investigation. The anchor continued, his voice echoing in the quiet timber lodge. A spokesperson for the Bureau stated that the entire case was blown wide open by an anonymous whistleblower operating deep within the municipal planning sector. This individual systematically gathered forged geological surveys, manipulated zoning approvals, and raw cadastral maps. They bypassed local corruption and handed the federal government a flawless, irrefutable blueprint of Vance's entire criminal enterprise. The live footage of Julian being shoved into the back of an armored truck faded away. The screen transitioned to a studio graphic. Just moments ago, the federal prosecutor's office unsealed the preliminary indictment, publicly revealing the name of the municipal employee whose meticulous data collection brought down this empire. A photograph appeared on the left side of the screen. It was a standard government-issued identification photo. The man in the picture had a calm, steady gaze, a sharp jawline, and a slight knowing curve to his lips. Beneath the photograph, spelled out in crisp, white, undeniable letters, was his name: Leo Garza. The blue light of the television flickered over my face. The room was so silent I could hear the snow hitting the window panes. Slowly, numbly, I turned my head away from the glowing screen. My husband was sitting right next to me. He was still holding the remote control. He did not look surprised or scared or guilty. He met my stunned gaze, the harsh television light reflecting in his dark eyes, and he gave me the exact same steady, peaceful smile he had given me at the altar. The silence in the lodge felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, isolating quiet of a blizzard, but the ringing aftermath of an explosion. I looked at Leo, waiting for the illusion to break, waiting for him to tell me it was a mistake or a coincidence. But he just reached over, gently took the remote from my hands, and turned the television off. The screen faded to black, and the room was swallowed by the warm, dim light of the hearth once more. The topographical surveys were entirely fabricated, Leo said, his voice steady, carrying the calm cadence of a man explaining a simple math problem. I noticed it during a routine zoning review 5 months ago. The soil density reports did not match the historical geological data of the county. When I dug deeper into the cadastral maps, I found that the boundaries for his supposed eco-resort overlapped with protected federal wetlands. Worse, the corporate entities filing the permits were shell companies traced back to known offshore laundering hubs. It was sloppy work masked by expensive suits and loud confidence. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the timeline. 5 months. You have known about this for 5 months. I filed the initial whistleblower report to the Federal Task Force 150 days ago. He confirmed, pouring a glass of water and setting it in front of me. The agents needed a municipal insider to quietly funnel them the unaltered land registries without tipping off the local officials Julian had already bought. I agreed. Why did you not tell me? My voice was barely a whisper. I was not angry, just profoundly unmoored. Leo leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that anchored me. Because I know your family, Haley. If I had told you, the burden of that secret would have destroyed you. Your mother would have noticed your anxiety. She would have pried it out of you. And the moment they realized I was building a federal case against their golden ticket, they would have used every emotional weapon in their arsenal to break you down. They would have forced you to beg me to stop. I refused to let them turn you into an accomplice to a felony, and I absolutely refused to let their greed overshadow our wedding day. You deserved one day of peace. He was right. Every agonizing word was true. If I had known, I would have spent the last 5 months suffocating under the weight of my family's impending doom, desperately trying to save them from themselves. Leo had not kept a secret to deceive me. He had built a fortress to protect me. We packed our bags in silence and drove back to our modest suburban home at the first light of dawn. We had barely been inside for 20 minutes when the screeching of tires tore through the quiet neighborhood. A massive luxury sports utility vehicle, splattered with freezing mud and highway salt, slammed onto the curb right across our front lawn. The doors flew open before the engine even cut off. My parents and Chloe practically ripped our front door off its hinges. They did not knock. They did not bring a wedding gift. There was no "congratulations on your marriage" or "we are sorry we missed the ceremony." "You ruined my life," Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking in a hysterical pitch. She lunged into the foyer. Her expensive silk dress wrinkled and stained, her mascara smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Leo, who was calmly standing by the kitchen island unpacking our leftover wedding cake. "You jealous, pathetic little man. You could not stand seeing me successful, could you? You had to destroy my future." My mother was right behind her, her face a mask of purple, hyperventilating rage. "How could you do this to your own family?" she screamed, marching toward me, entirely ignoring my husband. "Do you have any idea the humiliation we suffered last night? The feds detained us for 4 hours. 4 hours in a holding room, Haley. Our friends saw everything. Our reputation is completely obliterated. I stood between them and my husband. A strange, icy detachment washed over me. For 3 decades, their panic had been my command. Their emergencies had been my adrenaline. But looking at them now, standing in my hallway screaming like rabid animals, I felt nothing but a clinical, chilling disgust. Reputation? I asked, my voice dangerously low and razor-sharp. The sudden drop in my volume forced them to pause. Julian Vance is a federal criminal. He was dumping carcinogenic chemicals into the municipal water supply and washing cartel money through fake real estate. Why are you standing in my house mourning the arrest of a cartel associate? You should be on your knees thanking whatever God you believe in that you are not sitting in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy right now. My father, who had been lingering nervously by the door, finally spoke. His face was ashen, his hands trembling violently. You do not understand, Haley. It is not just about the engagement. We backed him. We vouched for him to our country club friends. Vouched with what? I snapped, stepping closer to my father. My analytical brain, the one I used every day to calculate catastrophic risk, suddenly began connecting the terrifying dots. Julian did not care about their country club friends. Julian cared about liquidity. He is a billionaire, or at least he pretended to be. He would not give you the time of day just for introductions. You bought your way into his inner circle, did you not? With what money? My mother's face drained of all color. She looked away, her eyes darting frantically around the room. We had to make an investment, she mumbled defensively. It was a guaranteed return, a chance for generational wealth. With what money? I demanded, my voice cracking like a whip. You have no savings. You carry maxed-out credit cards. Where did you get the capital to impress a fraudster? The silence that followed was suffocating. Chloe stopped crying, biting her lip and looking at the floor. My father swallowed hard, unable to meet my gaze. We took out a second mortgage on the house. My mother finally whispered, her voice trembling not with guilt, but with the terror of a gambler who had just lost the house. And we cashed out the accounts. My heart physically stopped. The blood roared in my ears. Which accounts? I asked, though my soul already knew the answer. The trust, my father choked out. The medical trust. The room began to spin. 10 years ago, after a severe car accident, I was awarded a specific settlement. It was placed into a locked medical trust fund legally designated to pay for a highly complex, inevitable spinal fusion surgery my doctors told me I would need before I turned 35. It was my safety net. It was my ability to walk without agony in the future. Because I trusted them, because I was the dutiful, foolish daughter, my parents remained the legal executors of that account. How much? I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. All of it, my mother snapped, suddenly defensive again, trying to justify the unjustifiable. $250,000. But Julian promised us a triple return in 6 months. We were going to put your little surgery money right back, Haley. We were going to give you even more. The world crystallized. The heavy, blinding fog of familial duty that had clouded my entire existence evaporated in a single second. I looked at the 3 people standing in my home. I saw them for exactly what they were. I had spent my entire adult life acting as their foundation. I had bailed them out, managed their crises, and sacrificed my own peace to keep their lives stable. And in return, they had literally stolen the bones from my back. They had gambled away my physical health, my future mobility, and my safety, just to buy a seat at a table of illusions. They were perfectly willing to break my spine so my sister could wear a bigger diamond. There was no misunderstanding. There was no tragic mistake. It was a cold, calculated transaction, and I was the currency they had spent. Chloe stepped forward, her initial shock morphing into a desperate, calculating frenzy. The tears drying on her face were replaced by a hardened, ruthless expression I had never seen before. "You can fix this," she said, her voice dropping to a frantic, conspiratorial whisper. "You work at Ethelgard Risk Management. You handle disaster mitigation for Fortune 500 companies. You have top-tier security clearance and direct access to federal databases. I stared at her genuinely, trying to comprehend the absolute insanity of the words coming out of her mouth. What exactly are you suggesting, Chloe? I am suggesting you do your job and protect your family, she shrieked, grabbing my forearm with a bruising grip. You need to log into your corporate network. You need to wipe those files. Intercept the Environmental Protection Agency reports, corrupt the data packets, erase the server logs, do whatever it is you people do. Julian has a team of elite lawyers, but they need time to build a defense. If you delete the cadastral maps your husband submitted, they will not have enough physical evidence to hold him without bail. You can make this all go away. I forcefully yanked my arm out of her grasp. You want me to commit federal obstruction of justice? I asked, my voice dangerously flat. You want me to risk 20 years in a federal penitentiary to destroy evidence against a man who just stole my medical trust fund? He did not steal it, she screamed back, stomping her foot like a petulant child. It was an investment, and if you do not get him out of federal custody, we lose absolutely everything. My mother stepped up, pushing Chloe gently aside, taking on her most authoritative matriarchal tone. It was the exact tone she used when she expected absolute obedience, the tone that had controlled me for 3 decades. Chloe is right about one thing. We are in a severe crisis, but even if you cannot wipe the federal servers, there is a much more immediate financial issue we need to address today. The bank is going to call in the loan on our house by the end of the month when the fraud news hits the local papers and our credit rating plummets. She looked around my living room, her eyes greedily calculating the square footage, the custom hardwood floors, and the newly renovated kitchen. You two own this place outright. You need to go down to the bank tomorrow morning and take out a maximum equity line of credit. You can easily pull $300,000 out of this property to cover our debt and keep a roof over our heads. I let out a harsh, involuntary laugh. It sounded like scraping metal. You want me to mortgage my home, to put myself hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, to pay off the money you lost by stealing my future surgery fund? It is your husband's fault. My father suddenly roared, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. He pointed a violently shaking finger at Leo. If he had just kept his mouth shut and minded his own business, none of this would have happened. Julian was days away from closing a massive offshore deal. We would have been rich. Your husband called the police. He caused this financial ruin, so he has a moral and financial obligation to fix it. He owes us. Before I could unleash the absolute fury building in my chest, Leo stepped past me. He did not raise his voice. He did not look angry or intimidated. He moved with the slow, deliberate precision of a surgeon preparing to make a fatal incision. He walked over to his leather briefcase resting on the console table, snapped the brass latches open, and withdrew a single manila folder. Julian Vance was never going to close an offshore deal, Leo said, his voice echoing with absolute authority in the sudden quiet of the room. He pulled out a printed document and tossed it onto the coffee table. It slid to a stop right in front of Chloe. That is a copy of a flight manifest and a wire transfer receipt from 2 weeks ago. Chloe stared at the paper but stubbornly refused to touch it. 2 weeks ago, while you were picking out floral arrangements for your engagement party, your fiancé wired 95% of his liquid assets, including the $250,000 he took from your parents, to a private bank account in a nation that holds absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States, Leo explained, his tone completely clinical and devoid of pity. He also purchased a one-way first-class ticket to that same country. The flight was scheduled to depart at 6 in the morning today. He was not planning a wedding, Chloe. He was packing his bags. He was going to take the money and leave you here to face the federal investigators alone as his primary scapegoat. The truth was lying right there on the table in black and white. The flight number, the destination, the massive withdrawal amounts. A rational person would have collapsed. A rational person would have realized they had been played for a fool and that their family was nothing but a pawn in a massive con game. But Chloe was not rational. She was a cornered, narcissistic animal whose entire identity was built on an illusion of superiority. She snatched the paper from the table, ripped it into jagged pieces, and threw them aggressively at Leo's chest. "This is fake," she screamed, her voice tearing at the seams, completely unhinged. She turned her venomous glare onto me, her eyes wide with madness. "You manufactured this. You printed this out to ruin my life. You are just jealous. You have always been so insanely jealous of me. You could not stand the fact that I was marrying a billionaire while you were stuck marrying a lowly, pathetic municipal clerk. You wanted to destroy my happiness because your own life is so painfully mediocre and boring." Her words hung in the air, toxic and desperate. I waited for a fraction of a second. I waited for my mother to correct her. I waited for my father to intervene to tell his youngest daughter that she had gone too far. They did nothing. They just stood there glaring at me with the exact same entitlement, waiting for me to break. Waiting for me to apologize and open my checkbook just like I always did. But the well was completely dry. The vast reservoir of daughterly guilt and sisterly devotion had been entirely drained, leaving nothing but cold, hard bedrock. I looked at the three people standing in my living room, the people who shared my blood. I saw no family here. I saw a den of parasites who viewed my existence solely as a mechanism to absorb their failures and fund their delusions. I was not a daughter. I was not a sister. I was simply a scapegoat and an emergency fund. I walked slowly to the front door. I grabbed the heavy brass handle, turned it, and pulled the door wide open. The freezing winter wind instantly howled into the warm hallway, bringing with it a dusting of bitter snow. "Get out," I said. My voice was no longer loud or angry. It was absolute. It was the final echoing sound of a heavy steel vault locking shut forever. My mother blinked, genuinely confused, her authoritative mask slipping. "What did you just say?" "I said, get out of my house," I repeated, staring dead into her eyes without blinking. "You crossed the final line. You stole my health. You demanded my home. You asked me to commit a felony. And now you are standing in my living room insulting the only person in this entire world who actually loves and respects me. You cannot kick us out." "We are your family," my father yelled, stepping forward with a threatening posture. "I do not have a family," I replied, my voice steady and freezing cold. "I have a husband, and you three are trespassing in our home. You have exactly 10 seconds to walk out that door before my husband calls his friends at the local police department and has you forcefully arrested and dragged out in handcuffs." They stared at me in stunned, breathless silence. For the very first time in my entire life, they looked at my face and realized I was not bluffing. The terrifying realization finally dawned on my mother's face that her permanent safety net was truly irrevocably gone. Muttering bitter curses and crying tears of impotent rage, they stumbled past me out into the freezing cold driveway. I did not wait for them to reach their expensive, muddy car. I slammed the door shut and immediately engaged the heavy deadbolt. The loud metallic click echoed like a gunshot through the sudden beautiful silence of my home. Exactly 1 month later, the city of Portland convened a massive public hearing inside the grand auditorium of City Hall. The sheer scale of the fraud had decimated the local economy. Hundreds of people, including unpaid construction workers, small business owners, and devastated local investors, packed into the rows of wooden benches. The air in the room was thick with tension, desperation, and a fierce demand for answers. Leo had been officially subpoenaed by the municipal council. He was required to attend and present the raw municipal data to the public. He sat at a long mahogany table at the very front of the room, dressed in his plain gray work suit, quietly organizing his manila folders. I sat 3 rows back, tucked away in the middle of the crowd, wearing a dark wool coat and blending perfectly into the sea of anxious citizens. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. My family made their entrance. The transformation was meticulously engineered and absolutely nauseating. Gone were the designer silk dresses, the tailored suits, and the arrogant postures. My parents and Chloe shuffled down the aisle looking completely disheveled. They wore faded, oversized clothing. My mother had left her hair unstyled and flat. My father looked haggard, sporting days of unshaven stubble. They were brilliantly playing the role of the ultimate devastated victims. They knew exactly what they were doing. The city had established a multi-million-dollar emergency relief fund for defrauded citizens, and they were putting on a theatrical performance to secure a massive payout. Local news cameras immediately pivoted to capture their tragic procession. When the council opened the floor for victim impact statements, Chloe was the first to approach the center microphone. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium, her knuckles turning white, and let out a broken, trembling sob that instantly captured the sympathy of the entire room. "We lost absolutely everything," she cried into the microphone, her voice echoing tragically off the high vaulted ceilings. "My parents worked their entire lives to build a small nest egg. We trusted a man who promised to uplift this entire city. We were completely blinded and deceived, just like every single person sitting in this room today." She paused, wiping a tear from her cheek, playing the crowd like a maestro. Then the sorrow in her voice hardened into something sharp and venomous. "But what destroys my family the most is the betrayal from within," she continued, her voice trembling with manufactured rage. "The zoning issues were complex. They could have been audited and resolved legally, keeping the project alive and ensuring everyone in this room got paid. Instead, a specific municipal employee, someone who harbors a deeply personal, toxic vendetta against my family, chose to bypass all local authorities. He rushed to federal agents to blow this wildly out of proportion strictly to ruin us." She did not say his name. She did not have to. She turned her tear-streaked face and pointed a trembling finger directly at the table where my husband was sitting. He deliberately manipulated the timeline of the data to make the project look like a criminal enterprise before we even had a chance to fix the environmental oversights. He forced my elderly parents out onto the freezing streets out of pure selfish jealousy, and in doing so, he bankrupted half the contractors in this room. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Chloe gave the furious, grieving crowd exactly what they craved: a physical, accessible target for their rage. Julian Vance was locked away in a federal facility, untouchable. But Leo was sitting right there. The atmosphere in the auditorium violently shifted. The collective murmurs turned into a low, angry growl. I watched as the eyes of the defrauded citizens morphed from pity for the crying girl to hostile, glaring suspicion directed at my husband's back. Someone in the back row shouted a curse word. Another slammed their fist against a bench. Through it all, Leo did not move. He did not defend himself. He just kept his eyes calmly fixed on his documents, silently absorbing the toxic hatred of hundreds of strangers with the same quiet, unshakable endurance he had always shown me. For 30 years, my default survival mechanism had been to hide. I hated being perceived. I hated public conflict. I had spent my entire existence biting my tongue, swallowing my pride, and cleaning up their catastrophic messes from the shadows so they could keep their pristine reputations. But as I sat there, watching my innocent husband being publicly crucified by the very people who had stolen my medical fund, something deep within my chest fundamentally broke. The quiet, accommodating, terrified daughter I used to be simply ceased to exist. I slowly pushed back my wooden chair. The loud scrape of the legs against the floor cut through the angry murmuring. I stood up completely straight. Heads in the rows around me began to turn. I calmly buttoned my coat, adjusted my collar, and stepped out into the center aisle. I did not rush. I walked with slow, deliberate, heavy steps down the center of the auditorium. I kept my eyes locked on the podium, walking straight past the murmuring crowd, straight past the glaring lenses of the news cameras, and straight toward the family who was about to learn the terrifying reality of what happens when you finally push a risk analyst past her breaking point. The wooden floorboards creaked under my boots as I reached the front of the auditorium. Chloe, still gripping the edges of the podium, stopped her theatrical sobbing. She stared at me, her eyes widening in genuine panic, completely unsure of what I was doing there. I did not look at her. I gently but firmly placed my hand on her shoulder and pushed her aside. She was so shocked, she stumbled back a step, yielding the microphone to me. I looked out at the sea of angry, desperate faces. I looked at the news cameras blinking with bright red recording lights. Then I looked down at the mahogany table where Leo was sitting. He gave me a single affirming nod. "My name is Haley Garza," I began, my voice ringing out clear and steady through the massive speakers. "I am the older sister of the woman who just stood here and cried to you. I am also a senior data analyst at Ethelgard Risk Management. Following the federal raid last month, my firm's cybersecurity division was contracted to conduct a legal independent sweep of the seized corporate servers to assess the collateral damage for our corporate clients. During that deep dive into the encrypted communication logs, we recovered several deleted audio files. I think the people in this room, the people who lost their life savings, deserve to hear exactly what was in those files." I pulled my smartphone from my coat pocket, plugged it directly into the auxiliary cord resting on the podium, and turned the volume to maximum. I pressed play. A sharp burst of digital static hissed through the auditorium, followed by a voice. It was a voice I had known my entire life. It was the crisp, authoritative negotiating tone of my mother. "Julian, let us drop the act." My mother's recorded voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, chillingly clear. "My husband saw the raw geological reports left in your study. We know the municipal permits are entirely fake. We know you are dumping on protected land and that this whole eco-resort is a front to wash money." A brief pause followed on the recording, then Julian's slick, nervous voice replied, asking what she wanted. "We want equity," my mother's voice snapped back, dripping with cold, calculated greed. "We know you are bringing in millions from the local retail investors we introduced you to. We will keep them perfectly calm. We will continue to cover for you and play the oblivious, wealthy in-laws. We will guarantee their continued investments. But in exchange, we require a guaranteed 15% cut of the total profits the moment this project goes public. 15%, Julian. Otherwise, we go to the state regulators tomorrow." I hit the pause button. For 10 agonizing seconds, the massive auditorium was plunged into a silence so absolute, so suffocating, it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I turned my head slowly to look at my family. The theatrical masks of victimhood they had worn just moments before had completely disintegrated. My father was physically shaking his face the color of wet ash. Chloe stood frozen in place, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of horror. My mother looked as though she had been struck by lightning, staring at the phone on the podium with wide, terrified eyes. They were not victims. They had known about the fraud for 3 months. They were willing accomplices ready to throw their own community into financial ruin just to secure their 15%. Then the silence broke. It did not start as a murmur. It started as a roar. The sheer, unadulterated outrage of hundreds of betrayed citizens erupted like a volcano. The crowd surged forward, shouting furiously, pointing violently at my parents. The security guards at the perimeter of the room had to rush down the aisles, forming a physical barricade to keep the furious mob from rushing the stage. I leaned back into the microphone, my voice slicing through the chaotic screaming. "For 30 years, I have been the silent cleaner for this family," I declared, my tone ringing with finality. "I have paid their debts, hidden their flaws, and sacrificed my own future to keep their illusions alive. But blind loyalty is not love. It is complicity in evil. I refuse to be complicit for a single second longer. You are on your own." I unplugged my phone, slipping it back into my pocket. I stepped away from the podium, leaving my mother, my father, and my sister trapped on the stage under the blinding lights of the news cameras and the deafening fury of the city they tried to destroy. I walked down the small set of stairs and stopped at the mahogany table. Leo stood up. He did not say a word. He simply reached out and laced his fingers securely through mine. Together we turned our backs to the stage. The angry crowd automatically parted for us, creating a wide, clear path straight to the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. As we walked away, I could hear my mother screaming my name over the roar of the crowd, begging me to come back, begging me to fix it, begging me to save them one last time. I did not even turn my head. I pushed open the heavy doors, and Leo and I stepped out into the crisp, bright afternoon sunlight. 6 months later. The morning air was warm and fragrant, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. I sat on the back porch of a small, quiet house nestled deep in the Oregon countryside. The only sound interrupting the stillness was the cheerful singing of a cardinal in the oak tree above and the soft clinking of ceramic mugs. Leo sat next to me on a worn wooden bench, gently blowing the steam off his black coffee. He leaned over, kissing the side of my head before turning back to read his morning newspaper. My phone sat on the small table between us. It was completely silent. There were no frantic text messages, no hysterical voicemails, no demands for money, and no emergencies to manage. My family was currently entangled in a massive, agonizing web of federal indictments and civil lawsuits. They were bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and